so everyone who's joining us on the catch up, thank you very much for joining us on day 2 of Operation Respond 2026. Tonight, I have the pleasure of being joined by Jane Todd, and Jane is going to speak to you about the knock-on effect of funding changes for day nurseries. I know a very popular topic that many of you have obviously turned out tonight, or you're watching the recording, because this is exactly what you need to hear in order to respond to the challenges that we were talking about last night of 2026, rather than react to the challenges of 2026. So without further ado, I make it 7 o'clock. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you, Imogen. Yes, I think quite a lot of you have been here in previous years. I've spoken at the last few Operation Response. Well, if you don't know who I am, I'm Jane Todd. I work with nursery owners, particularly on the business side of running the settings. My doctorate's in education, and I was a teacher and had nursery settings, and I worked with the LEA and lectured and things. So lots of experience with it, and predominantly now I work with owners. And each year I think what we're going to be working on, and something the government does determines where we're going instead. So a few years ago, of course, furlough was the main topic. Now the main F word seems to be funding. But it's something we need to look at. So it's what we're going to be chatting about tonight. This is actually the 4th Operation Response session I've done with Imogen, and it's always a good chance to look back. And as Imogen said, Operation Respond, when Imogen first started, was all to prepare for the coming year at that point, so we could be proactive. And it's so interesting to look back and see how things have moved and what were the challenges. And so I look back at what I was talking about last year, which was the 3rd year of Operation Respond. And it was on funding then, but that was when we were thinking that it was coming in. We were talking about what could it look like when this 30-hour funding would be coming in for babies and for twos at that point in the forthcoming September. And we were thinking about some of the issues it could change, and thinking particularly about occupancy. So it's really quite interesting a year on of what's happened and what's changed, and where actually we were right in our thinking. So what my main challenge last year was potentially that it could be time for a major rethink. And well, how true were those words? I obviously did have my crystal ball tuned in, because actually for a lot of us, we have had to have a major rethink with our approach to funding. And I was thinking last year, we were thinking about shifting landscape and changing demands, that the new funding could bring in more children, change the ages we have, our room capacities. What would it mean if we need more staff, when knowing that the recruitment issues at the moment impact on occupancy, more hours, all of these things. And we talk about how all of these changing demands came down to actually we really needed to know and understand our occupancy so that we could respond to these challenges. And so last year I went through calculating occupancy, or understanding true occupancy, so that we could be thinking and making informed decisions about what we needed to put in place for the funding changes in September. Lovely. We were all on top of it, weren't we? And then a date that will be in my brain forever. Friday, 21st of February last year. Do you remember it? It's funny, isn't it? We remember things like when, the Twin Towers are hit, whatever. This is one of those dates I will not forget, because I was on holiday in the Yorkshire Dales without signal with my boys, and I started driving back and my phone was going bing, 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 bing. And I had to pull over in a lay-by reading the changes to funding proposals on my phone with minimal internet. So that day was the day where, now they said nothing had changed, but this was where, as you remember, the guidance on consumables and how it was worded and all those changes came in, and panic was afoot. Facebook was flooded with, what do we do? And at that point, actually, if the model that I've been recommended with people who work with, we could actually carry on with, it was actually compliant with the new guidance, the whole idea of a model that works and complies, and having, your model for your funded hours only. Then came a second date, Friday, the 7th of March. And that was when they added an additional Q&A document to the guidance, i.e. they knew that everyone had worked out that they could still do what they were doing. And they thought, oh, goodness, we need to tighten this a bit. So did it in the form of a Q&A, which was the document, which suddenly said you couldn't have different funding models, i.e., someone accessing a funded place had to be the same for anyone. So you couldn't have a different model, say if parents chose to pay more or chose to only have the funded hours. This then sparked quite a lot of, oh, you know what it sparked? Hours and hours we have spent looking like this. This is what we've lived, we've breathed, we've thought about, we've spent hours on. Not made any easier by the fact that different LEAs have interpreted things in slightly different ways, and depending on the approach for your LEA, some have been more supportive than others, or some have been more cautious than others. And as you've seen from Facebook groups and talking to other settings, this has been what we were living and breathing last year. And it was what I spent most of my time supporting owners with, trying to make sure you got a funding model that works twofold now. There was what we originally was needing to do anyway, a funding model that worked for your extra funding for babies and increased hours for two, and ensuring it complied with all the new guidance around consumables. And you needed a model that complied, but also a model that worked for you financially. And so this was big. And a lot of us have now got in place models, but not everybody has. And some have got a holding model in place, as it were, saying, I'm going to put this in place for now, and I'm going to see how next year, as in this current academic year, pans out to revise it. Some have said, I'm sticking to what I'm doing and I'll work it later. Others have had to totally change the whole business model. So this has been what's been occupying our heads, predominantly the business model side of it. And then on one hand, we thought, oh, we can breathe a sigh of relief now. We've done it. We've ticked the box. We've got it in place for September. But it's not been quite as simple as that, has there? Because it's been lots of ripple effects. Because actually, yes, there's the actual model itself, that have you got a model that's compliant and works financially for you? But as you've all experienced, there are other ripple effects to this. And that's what we're going to be thinking a bit about today. It's almost a bit of a year where, it's funny how I said last year, I said about shifting landscapes. Well, this year it is very much those shifting sands. We're seeing how things are going to pan out. It might be you've had a brilliant model, but due to the ages of children who signed up, or more parents opting out, or parents not opting out, that things are still shifting. It might be that your LEA were one of the ones that were quite late getting out their local agreement with yourselves, that you haven't had time. You might have been one of the LEAs who were sitting on a fence and said, we've put a model in place for it. I had one setting I was working with that the LEA had put a model in place for a term and had said, we're going to revise this again as we get there. Well, this means that we're not in a settled time. And I predicted last year that it wasn't going to be a settled sort of 48 months with the funding anyway. But with these extra elements, and then there have been further ripples, and there's been, you'll have heard them yourself, anecdotes of other settings, issues that have come up. So I just want us to think about some of these. There might be some things you've already encountered. It might be things you hadn't thought about, but you can put things in place to prepare for them. And just thinking more widely in case there's anything alongside. Now, obviously, this is all alongside everything else we're doing anyway, in terms of revised inspection frameworks and EYFS changes last September. It's like everything has hit the sector this year, hasn't it? And I bet you all so glad of the Christmas holidays when it came, but hopefully this sort of you're hitting 26 thinking, you know, if there's anything else outstanding on your list, it's the time to get on top of it. But let's think about some of these ripples. So from these changes, there are obviously some very immediate ripples, some sort of, or probably obvious ones that came up fairly quickly that you had to get your head around. So as I said, compliance with your LEA funding agreements. And I know it's easy when you've got jumping on Facebook groups, whatever, and people are saying all sorts of different things. And in a way, it's very interesting what others have said. But at the end of the day, you need to make sure you're comfortable and happy with your funding agreement and understand what's expected of you in order to receive your funding. For a lot of settings, your funded part of your turnover that is coming from funding has increased significantly. It might have been previously you were I don't know, 40, 50, 6% funded. And now I've had some settings up to 90, 95% funding. So that is a huge difference. That's a huge business and strategic difference. So, but knowing that if that is coming from the LEA, you don't want to do anything that's going to jeopardize you receiving that payment if you're relying on it for 80% of your income. So you really, really need to know what your LEA funding agreement says, what it is you've agreed to. You might want to have highlighted in it things that are potentially different or interpreted as slightly differently, or where they put an emphasis on compared to, say, the original DFE guidelines. So you need to know your funding agreement inside out and what you've actually agreed to, so that nothing can come back later where your funding's paused while anything's investigated, things like that. Now, I know there's wider campaigns about, LEAs overreaching. That's all very valid, and obviously if that's something you need to do, there's that side. But I'm sort of saying in the immediate, if your LEA agreement says you need to do XYZ to get this money, are you aware that what your LEA expects you to do, and is everything compliant? Now, quite a lot of people I'm working with are already starting to have audits. It seems that some of the LEAs are very officious on getting their audits done. I think some said that it's almost evidence for themselves that they've put into practice what they said they would. So even though audits were already happening, audits aren't a new thing, funding audits were already happening, but as usual, the difference between LEAs varied greatly as to how regularly they were. I had one lady who'd had three consecutive years, and someone who'd never ever had an audit from their LEA. So it has always varied, but there is definitely seems to be an increase in audits going on at the moment. And of course, should you be at risk of paying anything back or having anything uncovered, you need to be really comfortable with knowing what it is that you've signed, you've agreed to, etc. Remember, though, that if you've genuinely made an error or have misunderstood something, just be honest with them, and putting things in place to move forward is it. I think there's been so much change this year, and with some of these agreements being so late, they're not necessarily looking to penalise you and catch you out, but it's that you wanting to work with them to put things right if they're not. So make sure your LEA funding agreements inside out if you don't already. A big one that I'm an ambassador for, but not everyone sees it the same way. It's totally depends how you work. But to me, I think it's huge that you need to really know and understand your operating costs for each age group. Whereas several years ago, it almost came out in the wash. If you aimed for your sort of twos, you knew that your threes were slightly more and your babies less, etc. But it would average out. Particularly if you're making decisions, say like, should you expand your baby room, or you're very concerned that you're taking a lot less threes. Because of these operational changes, it's really important to know financially what this is going to mean, rather than sort of winging a prayer and I'm sure it'll come out in the wash. What does it mean if you need to take on a lot more babies? Actually, is it a lot of more money because the funding rate's higher, or due to your operating costs, if you're only breaking even on them, is it making no difference? But if you don't take those babies, you'll be thinking, for occupancy in the future, where are your new children coming from? So you've got these decisions to make. And I strongly believe that having those operating costs, knowing how much does it actually cost you per hour, for a baby, and you're setting a 2 or a 3, means that you can compare that against your private charges and your funded charges, so that your percentage profit margin on all the ages. And it might be, when I've done this with owners, that some of you've realised that actually it's your private fees you need to change, or your funding wasn't as bad as you thought, or it was even worse. But at least if you know this, you can make your decisions. So that helps you to make sure that your consumables are at the right level. It's a slightly bigger job. It feels slightly bigger. I think once you get into it, it's not as scary as most people have thought. But I think people think, oh gosh, this is lots of spreadsheets and lots of work. But it gives you the information you need to make that informed decision to be proactive. So I would recommend that. But if numbers isn't your thing and you find that side hard, I'll put my link on at the end if it's something you'd rather work with someone like myself on. Opt-out policies. Before this year, not many of us had an opt-out policy. Yes, technically, consumables have always been voluntary, but we've always just been honest and said to parents, this is what we need to charge because the funding doesn't cover it. Now you have to have your opt-out policy. Some have phrased it as an opt-in policy, whichever, but you've got to have the evidence, haven't you, that parents have had that choice, that they understand they don't have to pay it, and what the alternative is if they don't. And that, for some owners and managers and early years leadership teams, childminders call sleepless nights. Do you say a parent isn't paying for it, that child gets it anyway, but you're covering the cost yourself? Or do you withhold an experience from a child because they've not paid for it? Lots of moral, ethical dilemmas that come with that. And some of the decisions you've made have had to be head ones, not heart ones, from what you can afford to do as a business. So opt-out policies, this has been new. And along with opt-out policies, I said the implications, what happens if everyone opts out? Where does that leave you financially? What if nobody opts out? What if one or two? You need to know and have the confidence, because what's happened this year might be different to next year. You might have had not many this year, and next year it'll be different. But again, to respond to that, you need to understand what it looks like for you. So these opt-out policies, and alongside an opt-out for food, particularly, you might have had to totally revamp your food from home or packed lunch policy. What was in place previously, particularly with the change in nutritional guidelines as well, just to add something else in. Again, what about packed lunches? Can you afford to offer them or not afford to offer them? Have you got space? And whole big decisions people have had to make, the simple matter of what is a reasonable alternative if someone doesn't want to pay a meal charge. Huge. Communication with parents. I often say that working like your model, working a model that is comfortable, that is you're confident works financially for you, is one thing. Communicating that to parents is almost the second part of the story. And this is almost in its hardest stage now, in this time of change. In a year or so, it'll just be what is the norm. The hardest thing has been if you've had to change your business model, maybe you've had to change the hours you offer funding over. If you've had to change those bits, then you might have had to communicate, particularly to certain parents. It might have been they were on a really good deal before because they were coming, I don't know, maybe 9 till 3 every day and not paying anything extra. And suddenly you can't offer the funding like that because it just doesn't work for you. And you've had to change them on to 3 days of 8, 6, whatever it is. For some families, you might have had to make big changes. And that's always really hard because you're worried about losing families. You're worried about losing your customers. You're worried about those customer relations. And so the whole big thing about communication with parents is huge. And also, if you've got new families starting, there's been so much about, free places and all these hours free all over Facebook. There's lots of parents who have been misinformed or misunderstood what's going on. And they come with a certain expectation. And sometimes you're the one who has to burst that bubble if it's not quite what they think it is. And that's having to manage that in a way is a whole other part. So thinking about, yes, your verbal communication and how you've informed parents of changes, how you're telling parents what the charges are, because it's quite a complex model. I mean, at the end of the day, a funding model is designed almost on a school day, isn't it? The fact it's 38 weeks and 30 hours a week is designed on a 9 till 3, 38 weeks. It's just based on a school model. But for those of you who are PVIs on an 8 till 6 model, or 7:30 till whatever it is, a full-time model, we're trying to make one model match another operational model. And so it's never going to be neat and tidy. There's always going to be bits. So we're trying to make it as simple as possible for parents, but there are bits that are confusing or not straightforward, or they might need time to get their heads around. So of course, that communication with parents is huge and also takes time, doesn't it? And changes to invoices. Again, parents need to understand if they've always had an invoice that looks one way, why does it look different? Because, of course, from this January, we need to make sure it's really clear. We also had to make it clear that the funded hours were free at the point of delivery. But obviously, the way we have to separate the 3 types of consumables with the food charges, non-food and extracurricular, we've and some of us have been dependent on how our nursery software systems, if you use Blossom, Family, Nursery in a Box, whatever, some of us have been reliant on how they've put it together or the timings they've taken to do it. So we've got changes to invoices and whether parents understand that, make sure we do it. Staff understanding, which is a big one, because parents will ask staff questions and your staff need to feel comfortable with what they're explaining or not explaining. So again, taking the time to make sure your staff understand what all this means and what's going on. Admin time. This is one that you're probably all nodding your head at. This has taken a heck of a lot of your time up, hasn't it? And it's not going to just stop now, because you're going to be tracking your funding. You're going to have to make sure things are ready. If you're audited, you might be doing even more paperwork. All that communication with parents still termly of opt in, opt out, people who change their mind, parents ask questions. The admin time has ramped up considerably for this. Never mind the fact that, say, you've got so many more children on funding, so there is more paperwork by default of that. So immediate ripples are probably are all ones that you've experienced or are experiencing and are aware of. A lot of immediate ripples by these two changes of more funding and the changes to the consumables at the same time. So it doesn't just stop there, though, because there's further ripples, these wider ripples. And some of these ripples are the ones that not everyone is experiencing. Some are experiencing, and some who I've worked with have experienced these to quite a very serious detrimental effect as well, which is always sad. So your staff, employing more staff. Say you've got to take on more babies because this is the age of the children coming in, the ones who get more funding. That's all very well and good. We know we need it on a 1-to-3 ratio. You need more staff, don't you? Well, this is great when it's at a time where staff recruitment's not necessarily the easiest. So we can have all these parents wanting baby places, and you might have space to offer it to them. If you can't get staff, that's an issue. Or if you can't get staff who you feel are the right people for that specific baby role, or are the right people for your USP. I've had quite a few owners doing feels a very big compromise field, that they're staff who I don't feel are quite our setting. And if you were listening to Imogen's talk last night, it's going to be much harder, particularly going into this year, that if you're not going to want to be starting staff and then them not being right and then having to hold, this isn't going to work out, and changing staff. So if you're not confident that those staff are right for your setting, but you need them to fulfill these places, that can be hard. Never mind the fact that you will already be thinking ahead. These children are all 1-to-3 now. As this cohort go through, I'm going to need this. What's going to happen with staffing and longevity of these staff contracts? Is this a 1-year thing? Am I going to have the same number of babies next year for this to work out? So staffing, your room capacities. And I mentioned this last year. With the traditional model you might have had of a smaller baby room, a bit bigger 2s and a much bigger 3s room, because you had so many children starting when they turned 3 for their preschool hours. Well, that's just not going to be the case now, is it? You might get children starting because they've moved area or potentially a change of setting. But predominantly the model now is your new starters will be the babies eligible for the working parent funding, and hopefully they'll stay with you throughout. And odd ones will leave and odd ones will start. But it's going to be predominantly your new starters are going to be babies. Now, that might be slightly different depending on your demographic, but in general, that is going to be the trend. They're going to have their working funding and stay through. So where you might have had a small baby room, bigger 2, big 3, I've worked with quite a lot of settings recently. You go, our preschool room's not even half full, yet we're turning babies away. Do we just swap rooms? But this is the whole thing of thinking ahead, because you're obviously not just making a decision for this year, in this term. You're having to think, what happens? You'll map it through the 3-4 years of the children's journey with you. What happens if you swap your preschool room to the baby room? What happens if you do something else? And one lady I spoke to did swap their preschool room to a baby room, and they had a ripple that you might not have expected, but they showed the baby parents round when it was a 9-place small baby room, and the cozy baby room. And although they've worked to make the big 40-place preschool room cozy, obviously it's a very different feel. So suddenly in January, these parents show up with babies for their settling in sessions, and it's a different room to when they came on a visit, and they pictured this small room with a few members of staff. And suddenly it's a slightly different feel because it's a much bigger space. And the parents were saying, whoa, hang on, this isn't what we expected. And parents had a shock, and that almost had to be managed. And of course, the nursery had to then respond to that, be thinking, well, actually, this is slightly different to what we sold them. And they'd made a lovely room, but of course, it's different. If you've got a perception of a small baby room and you come and you get something different. So what are the impacts of swapping rooms? Some people haven't been able to swap rooms because of things like if the room's upstairs, downstairs, other logistics of toilets, changing areas. Some of you have got fairly flexible space where you can change and respond. Others, due to the nature of your building, particularly if you've got rooms that are detached or offset, it's not easy just to swap rooms. So the whole issue of room capacities and swapping rooms for some settings has been really huge to try and respond to how to fit these children in, but also without feeling that they're just swapping rooms every term or every year, trying to think what could this look like as the children move through here. Reductions in 3 starting. Now, for some settings, this has been quite big. Some it's not made a difference yet, and it'll be interesting to hear from yourselves whether for you it has made a difference yet. But because a lot of settings haven't got this as big an influx of 3s year, and if you're still okay this year, you might find it's next year it hits in. If those children have already had the working funding as 2s, you might find again they're already in and that you haven't got this influx of 3s. Well, how does that change your dynamics with less 3s? Are your staff comfortable with just moving to other rooms and ages? Does it mean you have to change how your 3s curriculum looks and how it works? If you've got less of them, you might even find there's a financial implications. Remember what I said about knowing your operating costs per age group? Well, that might work if you've had your preschool with 24 3-year-olds and 3 members of staff and they're on a 1-to-8. How does it work if you suddenly now got 10? You've still got 2 members of staff. That's your operating costs now going to be higher for your 3s, but how does it change the dynamics? And so for you, you'll need to look at how this looks for you. But some people, things are cropped up that they weren't expecting to crop up because of some of these changes. And the reduction in 3s has caused slightly different issues in different settings. And as I said, some of you it might not have hit yet, but you might be looking at your ahead to your numbers for next September and the one after. So I would definitely recommend now as you're doing your occupancy tracking, you are almost looking at almost a whole cycle of babies now of almost what the impact is going to be through their nursery journey, to see what some of these knock-ons could be. Well, there you go. I was ahead of myself. The forecasting occupancy. It's going to be really important to be, keep coming back to the whole point of this Operation Respond, being proactive. Knowing your occupancy is going to be absolute crucial over the next couple of years, and knowing ahead where you're at. And yes, there's going to be changes and tweaks, but you really need to almost have that map in your head of where you're going and where your peaks, your troughs are, or whether it's quite static. And then within that, not just overall numbers, your actual rooms will be really important to how you manage this, because I think there's going to be times where you have bottlenecks. And that's going to need to be one that you're watching for. So you might even need to be rethinking your policy of how you move rooms. Some people have got a fairly fluid organic, and the rooms are quite fluid organic, might be right. If you've had more of a traditional, this is our 0 to 2s room, this is our 2 to 3s, this is 3 to 4s, and then move on the birthday, you might find that if you're going to get to a bottleneck point, you might need to either relax that or change it slightly. Again, you might not. And this is where, if you know your occupancy and know where these trends are, if room moves ahead, you can preempt it, which means you can plan for it. By planning, you have slightly less of these knock-on things that we end up having to react to. Now, this is one that's been a funny one. You might have had this. This is universal credit not paying consumables. Now, this actually, this isn't new, but it's like, because it's become onto their radar, they've increased it. Because I remember one of my nurseries about 6 years ago, parents are knocking on the door going, it was just meal charges. They can't claim my meal charges back and things. So it has always technically been a thing, but because I think your invoicing is potentially more transparent and it's clearer that breakdown is for food, and I think it's very much, as I said, now on the radar. Universal credit saying they're not paying. Now, if you've had a family who've been getting 85% of their nursery bill paid by universal credit, and then they've moved on to funding, and depending how many, you see, it'll depend how many private hours it might. If there's a lot of private hours, they might still find that they're okay, but it's been particularly for those who've mainly only been funding, so the bills mainly consumables, and then universal credit aren't paying it. So you've got quite a lot of people who've started the term and they're 2 or 3 weeks into January, and parents going, oh, I've had my bill and I don't like this because I can't get this back from universal credit. I want to not have funding now and just be on universal credit pay or whatever. So you need to watch for that, and whether it's you help families work out which works better for them, or you just make sure you're so transparent and clear if families say we'll be claiming, universal credit, that they know that consumables aren't covered. Because what you don't want is families signing to say yes, we agree to pay consumables, thinking they're getting it from universal credit. Universal credit then won't pay them it back, and then they go, oh, I don't have to pay this anymore, I'm opting out now. So thinking back to that one on the last page about your admin time and the faff and the hassle, you might want to, again, be proactive and preempt this and ask parents on their information form, are you eligible for funding? Will you be using universal credit? So that you can give them the best advice and say, or you can make them aware, they will pay for this bit, they won't pay for that bit. This is what you need to do, so that parents are informed, because otherwise you end up with the fallout of it. And the worst thing is, of course, if you've got an unpaid nursery bill while you're disputing this and trying to work out what's going on. Funding audits, that was one I mentioned on the last slide. It's not, I haven't put it on immediate because it's into the slightly wider. Obviously, they weren't doing it straight off, but funding audits now will be for last term, which will have been the first term with new consumables, and anything going forward will be. So although people who were audited last term will have been for the summer term, there was a bit of a win between two models here. So as I said, be ready for a funding audit. Just make sure that you've got the stuff you need to justify back up against your how you're compliant. And as long as you've been following what you need to do, I've heard some where they're only in for an hour. So I've had ones where they're in all day. Don't assume because they're in all day that you've done something wrong. Some of them, it's just how your LEA work and the approach of, they're checking registers against what they signed up for, what you've claimed, what your invoices look like, etc., etc. As I said, it's not uncommon, so don't think you've been picked on, but it does mean that you may be asked questions, asked to justify, you might be asked to reword some things. If it's an overreach, yes, you might want to get advice on some of those things, but as I said, at the end of the day, with so much of your money coming in from funding, the hard thing is our hands are tied a bit, and we do want to get it right. And I wish it stopped there at wider ripples, but it doesn't, because there's even further ripples, and these might not apply to everyone, but these are some things that are already sort of coming on the radar. One thing that's been a huge thing for some settings already this term has been term start surges. Because, of course, the funding is in terms, and you've therefore got the starters starting the term after the birthday, you've got a very clear term type start. Now, when that was your threes and a few twos, okay, and you could still stagger a bit. But due to the number of hours people are usually claiming, and now babies have joined the term time surge, this has had an operational knock on to your day-to-day and your settings. Now, you'll still find some babies are starting in between terms because when mum's going back to work and they're just choosing to pay for that. But you might find that some have deliberately sat there with their calculator and their spreadsheet, worked out the best time to go to work to maximise the funding. So you will probably find, or you may not, but quite a few settings have, that this January in particular, you've got a heck of a lot more babies than you would normally. And then two, they're all starting at the same time. Huge. So where you might just have had one baby in a 9-place baby room and you planned the hairstart, suddenly you've doubled your baby room to 18 places and you've got 9 new starters all together on the same day. Now, it might be that you can stagger your settling in sessions, but if you've got parents going back to work very closely, you might find you haven't got as, you've had to do settling in sessions, say, before Christmas, or you can stagger to a certain extent, but still within a couple of weeks, you've got potentially 9 out of 18 new babies needing settling who've all been at home used to one-to-one with mum. Now, the knock-on effect for nurseries, that has caused a huge challenge. I've had quite a lot of nurses saying, we've deliberately had to overstaff, and we know that's a cost that we've got to cover because no one's going to pay that cost. But we know that if we don't do this, the dynamics, the pressure on my staff and the well-being of the staff in the baby room is going to be really impacted, because these are going to be long, stressful days, particularly if parents are wanting them in, pretty full days from the off and things. So this whole thing of term time surges and the knock-in effects on how you do settling in sessions, but then also the knock-on dynamics of a lot more babies, say, for example, at one time. How do your staff feel about that? How comfortable are your staff? What about things like I don't know, sleep facilities or facilities for if you know your children do need different ways to settle, etc. A lot of operational decisions might have to come if you've increased your numbers, or if you haven't increased your numbers. If suddenly you've got a lot starting at the same time, you might be having to review how you're doing this. And some, I've unfortunately known some settings we've actually had a really rough January or still in it because of how it's working. So it's something to be aware of in your planning of if there's ways you can stagger, if you're forced into having to think about these surges and what it could mean. But that could have a cost implication as well as an operational one, as well as I said, staff well-being due to this that stress. I mean, you know what it's like if there's one unsettled baby that then sets off another dum dum dum. So it's just things that you might be wanting to think about if it's not actually hit your setting yet. And if it has hit your setting, know that you're not alone in this. These are some of the real knock-on effects that we weren't thinking about last February when we're trying to work out, are we charging £8.50 a day or £10 a day for meals? It's about, gosh, this is going to mean we've got a whole load of babies starting together. And what does that mean? What does it look like? As I said about adapting rooms for different ages, there can be knock-on effects with that of, as I said, parent perceptions. It can be how your staff feel and work in those rooms. It could be some logistical things that come, as I said, things like because you've had to swap rooms, that things, I don't know, where the toilet facilities are or changing things aren't as good, or you might be having to put in hand washing sinks if you're making a new room a baby room. So there might be costs of adapting rooms, but also you might find that as you're working in different rooms, the different logistical things come up and you're doing all this at the same time. And in a year or two, you might have settled with that. But at the moment, people might be finding things are cropping up now because of how things are working, of what you have in place and things. So adapting rooms for different age groups, but also, as I said, both the short-term decision of that and the long-term of what that looks like. That impact of increased number of babies. Yes, there's the logistical stuff of even practical stuff of one setting, the issue was making up bottles, where when it'd only been a few babies in a room making up bottles and someone popping out to make bottles had worked for them. They'd increased their baby room slightly and got more children of the same age in. The same basically effectively one member of staff was constantly out making her bottles and they were worried there for about, the room left behind. And effectively they were having to overstaff by one member of staff just for someone to make up the bottles. So then it was looking at the whole thing of whether they could get a kitchenette in to make them in the room so someone wasn't leaving the room. But it's these knock-on effects of things that need thinking about. As I said, if you're employing a lot of staff to deal with needing babies on a 1 to 3, have you worked out for your setting that these are permanent, that you need these members of staff, or are you only employing them on short-term contracts while you work out what's happening with your numbers? Because these babies will be going through eventually, won't they, to the 3s and the 1 to 8. So it's thinking of if your patterns, how are your patterns going to look? As I said, bottlenecks for room changes, both because of the term change thing as well, but you might find you're getting bottlenecks in different places. So I'd got one setting who didn't have many babies and they'd taken a huge amount of babies on for September. They said, our funding rate is great, we're taking on loads of babies. Basically, they put 2s and 3s in one room and made 2 baby rooms because they've got low numbers of 2s and 3s. And then they've signed up the same number of babies ahead for next September on the waiting list. And now they've twigged that actually this isn't going to work out because there's only X number of 3s leaving and they can't fit them in. So it's things like thinking ahead with your numbers, but also those babies of when they turn ages and move through rooms. And as I said, if you can't actually move them through and you've got older babies who can't move up and you've signed up new babies to start, what does it look like? Are you prepared to put your 2s and 3s together? Does that work for your setting? Does it not? So there's these all sorts of things to think about with bottlenecks, because people are finding that actually it's almost because so many are going to be starting in terms that almost having a termly move up. So whereas they might have organically moved up as children's ages and they were ready, they've almost been forced into more September, cohort, January, April moves. have a look at your numbers and how that actually is going to work for you. But it's something to be aware of, to think ahead, to try and avoid these bottlenecks. As we said, reduction in threes starting, that can change the feel. And if you're a room who, I don't know, maybe you've got mixed ages in one room, a small set of, say, babies, two threes together. If you've got less threes, what does that look like if your threes were the ones who modelled things to the twos? How does it change the dynamic or the feeling if you haven't got those older, inquisitive children asking questions? Or it might be that you've got less children starting at three, but you still got a solid number of threes. But what does it look like for you? An interesting one is the impact on threes going to school. I don't know about you, whether you're in an area where you've got lots of threes who leave to go to school nursery, to go to proper nursery or school nursery, and you might have that pattern where you lose a lot. It's going to be interesting, I think, to see over this next year and the year after, whether that's still as much a trend. If you think of babies who are starting with you, say 8 till 6, working parents, starting with you as babies, and they stay as twos, and they're happy and they've built up those relationships, are they suddenly going to want to go, oh, actually, I want to go to 9 till 3 term time only at the local school now? Or because they've started with you as babies, and there's so many more babies starting because of this funding, whether actually they'll stay put. Because I think there's more of a difference, say, potentially when children weren't in a setting to go, oh, do we want to go to a school term time only setting? Do we want to go private? Or even some who might have changed to get thinking they could get into a school. But I think there's more understanding now about going to school nursery doesn't necessarily mean automatically, get a place at school. Now, there's some schools who are, it's been the opposite. They've changed to almost a day nursery model in the school, and they're putting on that before and after school care and make it 8 to 6. And couple I've spoken to recently who go through the summer holidays, only the nursery, not the rest of the school, to try and respond to that. So schools aren't fully settled with this either. So I think it's going to be interesting to see actually whether you find that you lose less of your threes to school if you actually keep them. But it'd be interesting to see, and that might depend on your context or demographic. But I think it'll be an interesting one to watch and see if that's impacted as well. Cash flow. Now, this has been a biggie, a real biggie, particularly last term, September term. A lot of people had to get their estimates into their LEAs in June time. Now, if you were a cautious nursery owner or nursery manager who literally put in the right numbers of those you'd got the codes for and everything at the time in June, when is the cut-off for funding? 31st of August. There is a lot of time from June, July, August for people to sign up and get codes. So quite a few settings I'm aware of, and quite a few I've worked quite closely with, had the issue in September that when they got their initial payment, which was based on their estimates in June, they got a much lower payment than actually they got reality of number of children starting. And if they were in the LEA where they were getting a large chunk up front and a smaller chunk in December, and adjustments in the December one, we had a huge issue of cash flow. And it didn't just affect those who paid up front, and even those paid monthly, if they weren't being paid till the end of September or end of October as adjustments because it was happening in September, and 80% of your money is coming in for this funding, you haven't just got the invoices from parents to cover your staff wages. I had quite a few instances of day nursery owners having to take out loans in September to be able to pay staff in September while they're working this out. Now, it might be that as you're getting used to the foibles of the LEA and numbers, and we almost learn the game, that this settles down. But it's something to be aware of, particularly because if a large amount of your money is coming from the LEA, you can't control that. So you need to know you're okay. And this is where you need to know how much money is coming in privately, when it's coming in. It could be the money from the LEA comes in is enough, but say your LEA pay on the last day of the month and you've always paid your staff on, I'm making this up, say you've always paid your staff on the 20th, it might have an impact. And this might be where, you're having to look at your contracts and where you've always, what your pay date has always been. And it could be that you might change the day private invoices need to be paid, but you might find if that's only 10-20% of your income, it's not enough to make a difference. One positive there on your further ripples that I've not actually put up on the slide is Yes, you're spending more admin time on funding, but as one nursery owner said, they've not spent as long on debt collection because there's less parents paying them directly. They've found they've not had to spend as long on debt collection and chasing because there's less chase. It probably might seem a small positive compared to the paperwork of funding, but it's one that could potentially be there. So at least you know that your council will pay you that money. You shouldn't be in a position where you give that child 2 or 3 months, they give you an excuse, they haven't paid their bill, they've racked up 2 grand and they've disappeared and you don't get the money back. In a way, the money's guaranteed, but you do need to make sure the cash flow works for you. And if there is going to be a crunch point where it looks like it might not work for you, what is your contingency plan? Do you have savings? I mean, it used to be that we used to try and say that in your current account, you try and always have enough money that you can cover a month's expenses should there be a delay in that. Not everyone's in a position they can do that anymore. So what does it look like? Have you got personal cash you can put in? What's your LEA like on having to change payments? Be aware of this, of what would it mean if your cash flow was low? What is your plan? So rather than having to be reactive if it happens, what is the plan? So just watch this with estimates of you need to know for your LEA where your estimates go in and what would happen if you get X number of children more after that. And then, your adjustments are going to be later and things. So you need to know the impact of that because you don't want to get yourself in a sticky wicket with that one. So there's quite a lot of these extra things are impacting your operations, not just your piece of paper that says how your funding model. So although the initial thing with all of this was what does it mean for our funding model, as we've seen from these last couple of slides, there's a lot of operational things, and some of these might not have hit you yet, and there'll be others that might appear due to the makeup of your setting and the individual way your setting works. So what we've got to try and do, easier said than done, is try and take control of these ripples where we can. So trying to be proactive. So it might be that we need to have a bit of a mindset shift from reacting to the funding changes to trying to plan for them strategically, so that if we get these ripples, we're in a better place to deal with them, or we've already got a plan in place for them. So it might be that you, whether it's you as an individual, you as a management team, you with other owners, you with whoever there could be, might want to think about what could the ripple be in your setting or settings. Have some of these rung a bell? Of some of them you're not thought of, but thought, well, actually, yes, this could impact us. So it's that thinking ahead, trying to have your eyes ahead to the knock-on effects, not just this term, but what could the impact be on you for September, for next year, for the year after. And you might want to map out these potential ripples for your own nursery, where you think for you, whether it might be room changes, whether it might be the ages, whether it's your staffing, whether it's all of these things, operational things. What could these ripples be? What could you do about them? Or is there anything you can do? Because if you can understand the knock-on effects, that's the first step, being aware they could happen. And then the next is putting in these systems to try and manage them sustainably, because some of these things could be financial as well, couldn't they, like the cash flow ones. Now, what I've got over the next 4 slides, probably not going to be time to go through them, but I know that this is going to be shared. So I've just put like some ideas of a tick list, just might give you some ideas of things to work through, or so you can see if you ticked all these as you go through, you probably got your systems in place, your plan in place. Great. If you're thinking at the end of this, I don't think I've done any of those, it might give you an idea of things to focus on. So split them into 4 sections. So with leadership and strategy, your clear vision, whether you review your operational and financial performance regularly, strategic planning meetings. So not just looking at daily problem solving, that you think ahead to some of these things. If you've got a plan in place for the future challenges like the staffing, the occupancy, the room changes, funding. So there's some things. Then there's, of course, your financial sustainability. Do you know your true cost per child, including staff, overheads, consumables? Have you reviewed the funding changes against your actual costs and session structure, not just what everyone else has done, or I think that'll do and I hope that's all right. Is it actually based on your actual operating costs, not against your prices? Your prices are different unless your prices are really grounded in your operating costs. Make sure it's against your outgoings. Is your fee structure sustainable for non-funded hours or extra services? Are you monitoring your cash flow, not just at a year end? You might be someone who always just did it at the year end and it's always been okay. You might need to be a bit more proactive with that to make sure you're not going to get in a sticky wicket. Your occupancy and operations. Do you track attendance patterns and adjust room allocations accordingly? Have you thought ahead if you've got potential term start surgeries coming up? Do you know now? Is April looking pretty calm? Or are you already thinking, I've got 26 and a half babies starting in April? You know, where are you at? And have you planned for it in both your staffing, your scheduling, your settling in sessions, systems to track and manage your funded hours effectively, monitoring this occupancy for the next 2 academic years to make your operational decisions? So again, if you can tick all those, you're probably on it. If you haven't started thinking about these are the ideas. Parent communication. Do your parents understand these changes to funding and how it works? Have you made it as simple and as clear? The more simple and clear it is, the more your staff and your parents get it, the less likely it's going to get confused, the less likely they're going to come back and go, I don't get this, or this wasn't what you said. You know, make it easy for yourself, make it simple as possible. So make sure your funding model's simple and clear to understand and to actually operate. Have you got processes to manage if you get queries efficiently and consistently? You don't want to be telling one parent one thing and then another staff member tells another parent another thing. Those 2 parents chat, then it's on Facebook. Then the next thing you're in the press as that nursery who said this. You know, what's your response if parents are questioning something? Have you got a general response? Actually, this is the reason. And you're consistent. And it might be things like this you haven't thought about, but it's amazing how one thing can unravel and you find, you think, oh, goodness. Clear messaging. If you've got really clear messaging, and this is one I really strongly believe in, on the value of your nursery beyond funding, of who you are, why you are who you are, what your USP is, what you're all about. If that is so clear and your parents really believe in you and the value of you and what you bring, that is such a big thing in this, because then your parents are signed into you. So in a way, if you then clearly explain the funding, they go, okay, we get it because we want you. So actually, the more they've bought into who you are and what you are for them, the more they're going to be on board with this. So I know it's not long now, but it might be something you want to reflect on afterwards. What is at least one, potentially more? I want to leave you with something to do, not just that you've listened to me, thinking an operational change you can make to try and reduce the impact of these funding changes, or at least so you're being proactive so that if you get these ripples, you're ahead of the game in dealing with them. Because there's going to be so much going on this year, as I said, with your new Ofsted inspections and your EYFS and your all your employment changes. There's so much going on that the last thing you need is a distraction of having to deal with some fallout for the funding because you hadn't thought ahead and didn't see it coming. So the more you can think ahead, you're kind of using your time better. So have a think about and at least potentially one operational change you can make to try and reduce the impact of these funding changes, or at least make them simpler for yourself. And ironically, the question from last year, it might be that actually it's time for a rethink, and it might be that you've kind of papered over the cracks or sort of fudged your model a bit, and actually you're hoping it's okay, or you've deliberately chosen to see how this year's panning out. And it might be actually you say, in 2026, I need to have a major rethink or a rethink, review this and make sure you're moving into the year with confidence, that actually you're confident that your model works financially, it works practically, and it works operationally. And if that's one of these areas, particularly with the money side of things, where you think, I don't do that and it's not me and I can't do it, there is help out there. Do join my Facebook group, Jane Todd Nursery Business Support. My other details are on there as well. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, and my website's there. I do run a Thrive program to work with nursery owners on this. So if this is one of those things where you think, just give me the children, the curriculum, and the bit I love, and this bit's not me, can help with all that side in our Thrive program. Got a nursery owners business retreat coming up as well, business owners, all that side. So if any of that, you need help with those funding models, those calculating those costs, any of that, there is help out there with people like myself who can help you with that, because it's definitely worth, if you'll be in a better position if you do know those numbers and know the impact of them, to be able to respond and to make those decisions. I'm aware I've covered an awful lot there, and I feel with some bits I could have gone into so much more depth, but hopefully some of that has resonated with you, and there's been bits in there that you might not have thought of that you've gone, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. That's something we could quite easily do. And hopefully that's been of some use for you.
Thank you, Jane. Yes, that's been amazing. If everyone can pop some questions, if they have got questions in the chat, then we can obviously go through those in the moments we've got left. And yeah, I mean, to answer one of your questions, Jane, have we come across anyone who is seeing a decline in numbers due to schools taking the children off the nursery? I was speaking to a nursery only yesterday who, would say that that was true of them, and the local school is still promoting the fact that if you have a child in our preschool, you will get a place in our school.
Yeah.
Yeah, whether that's true or not. But yeah, it does. It obviously it sways some people's thinking, doesn't it? So we have a question here.
Well, let's hope it's one I can answer.
Yeah, I'm sure it is. It's from the lovely Kerry. Do you have any info on getting the costs for each age group, please? Not sure where to start.
Oh yes, it is a big job, but it is something I can go through step by step of how to do it. It's basically having to work out, taking out your staffing costs and looking at all your operating costs and dividing that by but it's back to your occupancy, the number of kids you've actually got rather than your number of places. And then looking at your general staffing costs, as it were, your shared staffing, your supernumerary staff, and again dividing those by your number of children, but then looking at specifically at the staffing fit you need for each age group, and you've got so that that's divided only by those children you've got in each age, and adding back up. That's the incredibly short answer of what takes a good few hours work. But yes,
Yeah.
I can go through that, and I think I have some slides on that I can pop in my Facebook group page as well. So yes.
Yeah. So Kerry, if you or anyone else needs that support, then you've got Jane's contact details on screen. Drop her a message and get hold of her via a website, and she'll hopefully be able to help you and assist you to do that. And that could be money very well spent
Yeah,
if it
it
answers
takes
that
a few hours
question.
to do, but as I said, the difference it makes
Yeah.
is huge. And then once you've done it and you just keep on top of it, it's
Yeah,
so
I think we were promoting. I mean, you say 4 years, and I think that might be down to Harry thinking it's 4 years, but of course he wants to be older than he is.
it
I
was
think
only
it's
because I
actually
looked at last year's slide, it said third year.
yeah. Well, I think Harry might have added a year last year as well,
Oh,
but
did
it's
it?
definitely the third year. It's definitely the third year of Operation Respond. But yeah, we're getting ahead of ourselves, aren't we? But I think in year one you were saying know your numbers, Jane. So you're
Yeah,
being
I was. Yeah,
consistent. You're
yeah.
being consistent. So the next question is: after a recent Ofsted inspection, we had a regulatory inspector
Uh,
who felt by stating what additional fees were was not inclusive. Ooh. What do you think about that?
well, the hard thing is because you have to state what additional fees are to comply for your LEA agreement. Now, obviously, from January, it has to be on the website. So you have to
Mm,
be very clear what your additional charges are for. The hard thing is back to what I said X number of minutes ago of having to make the moral and ethical decisions of what happens if children don't want to opt into something. And it's
mm,
the whole thing of, and this will totally depend on your setting. Clearly, if you're a forest school and someone signed up and doesn't want to pay additional fees, and you say, fine, you're just sitting in a tent colouring in, then they're going to say,
mm,
we're not getting the forest school experience. However, if you have, I don't know, little Johnny's football coaching coming in, and that child
mm.
doesn't want to pay for football, so they don't go
Yeah,
along with the other 10, that's less complicated. It depends what it is and what the impact is on the child. And I think there's also something about who it is. If you know it's genuinely that family that are struggling and haven't got the money and
mm,
haven't got the money, you know, we all would just say, don't worry, let them go along to the baking activity. It doesn't matter. When
mm.
it's a parent, I'm making this up, say, I don't know, just make it up. Dad's a solicitor, mum's a doctor.
Yeah.
Money's not the issue. It's the principle of I know my rights and
Principle,
I
it's
don't have to
free. The
pay for
government said it
this.
was free. Yeah.
You might be less inclined to say, oh, little
Yeah,
John
yeah.
can go to baking. You might say, well, I'm really sorry, you haven't paid for him to go to baking, so we can't go to baking. It's
Yeah,
like if you
yeah.
don't pay for him to go to piano lessons in your own time, you ain't going to get piano lessons. So this
No.
is the hard one of, you know, your demographic, you know, your families. And I think sometimes we all make little heart decisions at the right point because that's why we're in the job. But there is a thing of, if everyone said no, I don't want to do it and can't pay, what can you offer, and why have they chosen you? If they've chosen you for the extra things but don't pay for it, well,
Yeah.
if you can't afford to cover the cost, you can't do it. It's that hard head and heart thing, but you have to decide, does the child not get it? Or which, if you are only charging for the really extracurricular things, it's quite clearly defined, isn't it? You don't pay for that trip, you don't go on the trip. Whereas if you're saying they miss out a bit we do all the time in nursery, that gets a bit tricky. I think that's why it's easy if you can keep the consumables to food, non-food, and extra specified activities. It makes it a bit less blurry.
Yeah, it does. And you know, it despite the changes in Ofsted inspections, I think we're always going to see Ofsted inspectors expressing their own pet peeves when they see things, because and how could they possibly be aware of everything that every local authority puts out when they may be inspecting in your local authority today and in someone else's local authority
And
tomorrow?
inclusion is a big thing in the new
Yeah.
inspection framework. It is too. So you might expect a question on that of what happens if people opt out. And that's why I said the simpler your
Mm.
model is. I mean, there was one Facebook debate ages ago where people were arguing over should you be charging for goggly eyes because goggly eyes aren't basic crappers, and they're extra. I think the more you get into tiny details of there's this and there's this and there's this, and then
Yeah.
are you going to withhold the goggly eyes? They can't put it on their card. You're then going to look like you're not inclusive. Whereas said if you make even if you're hiding your costs under other labels, if you make it more these are meals and that's that, it might make it easier for you to tick the inclusion box because in a way it will get muddy otherwise. But the
Yeah,
more
make
that
it
you
easy for
know,
yourself, as you
yeah.
say, keep it straightforward and simple. Well, that's your questions,
Oh,
Jane.
good.
So
I got off
everyone's giving you
lightly.
the love and thanking you very much for your time and how straightforward you are and how you express it in such an informative way and give everybody such a wonderful food for thought. So yes, I don't think there's any further questions on the chat, but yeah, you've made good sense. So
Oh,
that's
good.
always good, Jane. It's always good. Fair play for making good sense at 7 o'clock Tuesday. That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. Well, thank you everybody for your attendance this evening and supporting Operation Respond on day 2 of the 2026 cohort. We will put the recording of today's webinar up in the Facebook group tomorrow, and Harry will be on to that for you in the morning. But yeah, thanks everybody. Have a lovely evening and see you all soon on the next one, perhaps.